Today's video is brought to you by my latest book, When Religion Kills, a look at how the so-called faithful in many religions advocate murder in the name of their God. Buy it today. Just click on the link in the text portion of this podcast. So what do we do with so-called men of God who call upon their followers to kill people? Hi, this is Phil Gurski, and you're listening to Quick Hits. You know, growing up as a Roman Catholic in Canada, I have to admit I've had some really good priests as role models and some as dear friends in the past. But I do recall one, a young priest, I won't say his name, I won't say what parish he was in, who, when it was his turn to basically talk to the flock, if I can use that term, he'd be all fire and brimstone and critical, and this is wrong and that is wrong, and we're all doing things wrong, and the world's going to hell in a handbasket, yada, 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 yada. And he was very conservative, which is fine, but he wasn't a very likable man. He was not the kind of man who talked about the love of God and love of Jesus and how we should all love each other. He was quite the opposite. What if I told you that in the past 48 hours, I've come across two stories in the media, one involving a person I'm actually quite familiar with, about preachers who've essentially called upon those who listen to them to kill people. Yeah, to kill people. These preachers happen to be imams. They're Muslim preachers, one in Egypt and one in Canada, of all places. And they've both been preaching to their flock about recent events in France that have to do with a teacher who decided to use the infamous Muhammad cartoons to illustrate a point to his students. And let me just read to you what these preachers have said. So the first one is in Egypt. He's actually been arrested, referred to prosecution in that country, because he told people that he backs the killing of those who defame or lampoon the Prophet Muhammad. And he defended the recent knife attack in France, in which a teacher was beheaded. And he praised the terrorist, because this is what this was, an act of terrorism, as a descendant of Islam's 7th century warrior Khalid bin al-Walid. In other words, you draw a cartoon about Islam, about Muhammad, that I find objectionable, I'm going to tell people to kill you. That's number one. The second one is an individual in British Columbia called Yunus Kathrada. He teaches at an Islamic center, Kardala Ihsan, in Victoria, which is the capital of British Columbia. And he said that the teacher who was beheaded by the terrorists on the outskirts of Paris, Samuel Paty, he described him like a dirty excuse for a human being, a man who had a twisted soul, and he is damned. Furthermore, Mr. Kathrada has called upon, quote, the annihilation of the enemies of Islam, heretics, and atheists. And he's called upon God to help the true believers in fighting jihad. Yes, I know jihad is a complicated term in Islam, but what Mr. Kathrada is advocating has nothing to do with striving to become a real Muslim, a better Muslim, which is what are the meanings of jihad? No, this is a call for violence. And I noted that earlier that Mr. Kathrada is somebody that I am aware of. He came across my radar when I worked for CSIS a couple of years ago. I haven't worked for CSIS for 5.5 years, so what it tells me is that an individual who became known to us for what he was doing, which were threats to national security, doesn't seem to have changed one iota since my retirement, which kind of tells me maybe leopards don't change their spots. I'm going to get back to that theme in another Quick Hits podcast on de-radicalization, by the way, so stay tuned for that one. Why am I talking about this right now? For the simple reason that Muslims legitimately complain that they are stereotyped, that a lot of people see Islam as a religion that advocates violence at its core, that all Muslims are terrorists. And in the words of the infamous Ann Coulter, not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim. And they certainly suffer high degrees of discrimination in Western societies, including here in Canada. And that is simply unacceptable under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and what Canada stands for. And I also want to stress that these preachers, imams, who advocate this level of violence are few and far between. I have met many imams in my time at CSIS and since my retirement. I think they are fine, excellent gentlemen who are very faithful, but are also good human beings. So to emphasize, the vast majority of imams, Muslim preachers, do not advocate violence. So what do they do with the few that do? Well, Egypt has arrested this guy. They're going to try to figure out if they can lay charges against him. So kudos to Egypt. Not quite the thing I would have expected from Egypt. What about this guy out in Victoria? Is he still preaching at this Dar al-Ihsan Center in Victoria? Has he been asked to step down? Have Muslims on the, assuming there's some kind of Muslim council, have they taken him to task? Have they told him to shut his pie hole? Have they removed his ability to preach to other people? I don't know. I sincerely hope so, because it seems quite clear to me that anyone who calls the victim of a beheading a dirty piece of humanity who deserved to die does not deserve to have the opportunity to preach to Canadian Muslims. Maybe this has all been done. Maybe I'm a little bit behind the times. The article that I read stems from a couple of days ago, and maybe a lot's happened since this article was published. Although it was published in French in Canada, so I don't know how many Muslims on the West Coast speak French. But for those who are listening to my podcast, if you happen to be Muslim, you happen to be work for a mosque, either as an imam or on a board of directors, please ensure that Mr. Kathrada has no more opportunity to preach his version of hate and his version of violence to the followers of the mosque on Vancouver Island. This is completely unacceptable, not just under Canadian law, under any law. Men of the cloth, to use a generic term, should not be advocating the fold to go out and kill people. That may have worked 1,000 years ago when the Crusades were launched, when the Pope Urban II, I believe it was, essentially told people, Deus Levolt, God wills you to go across Europe and go defeat the Saracens, the Muslim invaders of the Holy Land. That was a millennium ago. This is not how we do things nowadays. And the same goes for Hindu preachers who preach against violence against Muslims. The same thing goes for Jewish rabbis who preach violence against non-believers. Same thing goes for Christian priests and pastors or whatever who preach violence. And Buddhist priests who, actually there are some. There's a famous one in Myanmar called Urantu. His nickname is the Buddhist Bin Laden, who's been preaching violence against the Rohingya, the Muslim minority in northwest Myanmar. So yes, every religion has these people who engage in completely unacceptable talk that engages in and encourages violence. And it's up to those people who belong to those communities and congregations to stop them, to fire them, to shut them up. Anything less of this is unacceptable. If you want to be taken seriously in 21st century world society, you cannot advocate the use of violence, and you cannot allow those who are supposedly men of faith, men of God, to urge their followers to do the same thing. This has to stop, and this has to stop now.